All right, so let's lock in and focus on the Russian Federation. We can't start anywhere but with Vladimir Putin. Basically, took over the reins from Boris Yeltsin right there during the crisis involving the Chechnya Wars, right there in 2000, and has been running the game ever since. He controls the executive branch and his party, as we're going to see, United Russia, and his, for lack of a better word, cronies and associates, if you want to be more fancy, have control over the Duma, legislature, and the court systems via what we call democratic centralism. The idea of if one party continues to win elections over and over and over again and installing all of their key appointees in all the places that are unelected, you basically end up with a dominant party system. And this was all Putin's doing. He doesn't have anyone in the current system to challenge him from within, and his only threats might possibly come from without. And even if there is someone who runs the Duma, who is running the majority party in the legislature in Russia, and this individual is still an individual who works directly for Putin, right? And just focuses on trying to push his policy through the legislature and get it passed. So the idea here is we're locking in on the vertical of power, aka hyper presidentialism. This is an elected body, the Duma, and it's an elective office, the president of the Russian Federation, but it's going to function more like an authoritarian regime than it will a much more democratic and open regime like we saw previously in the UK. That's why when I teach this course, I teach the course with the UK and the Russian Federation sort of at odds with each other. An example of a functioning classic parliament and a nation that has a parliament but doesn't really function in the same way that the parliament functions, and the executive power is much different in both as well. So let's go ahead and get into it in more detail. As we mentioned, the dominant party is United Russia. Looking at their platform, it seems to be more of a right wing sort of populist issue in terms of their policy agenda. Strong national defense, hyper patriotic, obviously, um, definitely wary of outsiders, putting forward a definite program of Russification or taking other ethnic groups and making them more Russian by kind of folding them into dominant Russian norms. They're definitely pro Putin, and they are the number one party right now, currently in the Duma, the Russian parliament. Other parties do exist. For instance, the number two party in last election cycle, with I want to say it was somewhere near between 8 to 10% of the vote, was the Communist Party, as in like what this Russian Federation used to be during the Cold War when it was the USSR, right? And there's like a liberal Democratic Party, a party called the Just Russia. It These things don't really have much import in real. I think the United Russia got something like 70+% of the vote last time, and the communists, for the most part, are in league with Putin because he was a former KGB asset working in East Germany in his previous life before he became a political actor, right? So in that situation, you're looking at 85 to 90% of all the main parties supporting Putin anyway. So they exist, but they can't really topple the political strength that United Russia has, which is why we say this is an example of a dominant party regime here. In this way, and this is true of all of six of the nations in this class, millions of people will vote in all six of these nations. But we call this something akin to more of a managed democracy. Putin doesn't mind if people vote so long as he continues to win every election. As long as he dictates the outcomes, people can vote as much as they want, right? In this way, it kind of seems foul to us from a Western sort of democratic perspective. But other nations we're going to find in Eurasia and in Africa as well have a similar concept that voting is fine so long as the strong men who run everything can still run everything just fine, regardless of the outcomes. And even better, control the electoral outcomes along the way. As a result, you probably would expect that you have very, very fraught experiences as a political activist in these sorts of governments, and Russia's no exception. Excuse me. There is protesting, right? But it is very much restricted. It is monitored, and as soon as it occurs, it's often suppressed. Sometimes not only by the official police or by the military or whatnot, but also by paramilitary or citizen groups that are very nationalized and very patriotic and loyal to Putin, who will carry out the various sorts of physical attacks on protesters, akin to what we're going to see later on with a group called the Basij, who do that on behalf of the supreme leader in Iran as well. Some examples of some prominent individuals pushing for social change and political change include the avant-garde punk band turned exiled and disgraced individuals, Pussy Riot, who put out many different, very aggressive anti-Putin music videos and did things such as play anti-Putin concerts in Russian Orthodox churches. Again, very much trying to essentially jostle the average Russian's political consciousness through extreme imagery. And it's very much a situation where in the UK, where you get a lot of agency through your party affiliation, through the relative norms involving enhanced civil liberties and civil rights to express yourself and have freedom to speak freely and freedom of the press, you find that you have very much more tame expressions of political activism there compared to now. I'm not saying occasionally it won't get out of hand and riot cops won't get called out sometimes, but um, you know, I can't think of a situation in which individuals would be so crass as to perform establishment music videos in, for instance, like a cathedral in the Anglican Church, as what would happen with Pussy Riot with their performances in Russian Orthodox cathedrals. And it tends to be and you're going to see it bear out in this class too, that the more open and more transparent your government is, when people will protest, is going to be relatively tame compared to when people finally build up so much angst and so much anger at repressive governments that when they protest, people end up getting killed. And speaking of people getting killed, that takes us to our next bullet there, talking about legit opposition movements trying to create sort of political momentum towards a new party or towards toppling United Russia, coming after Putin personally, which would be two examples come to mind. I have Navalny here, who was seen as somebody with enough cachet to possibly one day maybe run in a campaign against Vladimir Putin, who was jailed under suspicious corruption charges, and then later on suffered an acute case of SDS, sudden death syndrome, which also happened to an individual by the name of Evgeny Prigozhin, who was the leader of the Wagner group, who was, prosecuting the war. I'm sorry, the special military operation in Ukraine for Putin, who then essentially decided that, wait a second, you're not supporting the Wagner troops well enough. In fact, we're being so poorly treated and mismanaged, we're going to turn our vehicles around and start moving towards Moscow. He mysteriously was involved in a plane crash a few weeks after that event. So it's interesting to see that now we exist in a situation where no one dares openly challenge Putin for fear of, again, sudden death syndrome. So he's not really grooming anyone either to accept the reins of power from him as he ages. He's now changed the Russian constitution, I think, to the point where he can stay president until 2036. I estimate if he's still kicking, he's still around by then, he'll just alter it again so that he can retain more power and stay in office until he dies. And we'll talk about the connection between him and Mr. Yeltsin, his predecessor, to explain that mechanism of why he's doing it like that. When we're talking about response to political activism and protest, the media is very tightly controlled. On paper, you have the right to publish anything you want, but in practice, that'll get you hurt and or jailed. So no, you can start a non-governmental organization, but these NGOs have to be organized by and approved by the Russian Federation government. Therefore, we call them GONGOs, government organized and operated non-governmental organizations. So yeah, if you think that sounds kind of oxymoronic, kind of like jumbo shrimp right there, then it sort of is. They should be outside the auspices of government control. They should be able to register with government to operate, legally, of course, but to be having individuals embedded from the Russian government to make sure you're not making too many waves in your non-governmental organization, it doesn't seem to be very free. And as a result, for sure, as compared to the UK, which is labeled to be free by the folks over there at Freedom House, Russian Federation is very much a not free situation, focusing on using the law to repress individuals and ruthlessly surveilling individuals, with technological means and also with personal means. Again, think about Putin's background as a former intelligence asset, right? We're talking about an individual who has a number of former colleagues with whom he's embedded all sorts of these people throughout Russian society and Russian business and Russian, governmental situations in these gongos. Excuse me. And they are known as the Siloviki. So you don't know if you're just having a chat at the proverbial water cooler at the office in somewhere in, I don't know, St. Petersburg, and you start complaining about the regime, you could be talking to someone who will immediately go and just turn right to the security apparatus, the FSB, which is the new version of what used to be called the KGB during the Soviet days. And next thing you know, you end up facing some harsh legal sanctions, right? So let's then get into the institutions. In theory, on paper, the Russian Federation is semi-presidential, which is to say there's a president and a prime minister. But we talked about that a few moments ago, right? The prime minister is sort of ineffectual. And since the prime minister pretty much does the bidding of Mr. Putin, they essentially exist as an authoritarian regime. There are other nations that are semi-presidential that don't operate in this way at all. We don't talk about it in the course, but France is a good example with President Macron. And then I think he went through subsequently in his last re-election, I think 4 or 5 different prime ministers trying to hit on one that can actually run the National Assembly. So you do see this in other places, and in fact, we will revisit this model when we get to Iran again, who has a president right now, currently Mr. Pezeshkian, and has a prime minister of the Majlis, but it's a whole other model of authoritarian situation involving a theocratic structure because everything is done under the guidance of the supreme leader and the Guardian Council. The Russian legislature is a bicameral one. The parliament has 2 chambers. The State Duma is the lower house, and the Federation Council is the upper house. The lower house is elected. And when we use the word federation, that means that there are all sorts of varying levels of autonomous smaller bodies stitched together in this large quilt to make the Russian Federation. Places that have relatively, decent autonomy, such as a vast region in the Far East known as Saka, right, which would become one of the biggest nations in the world if it were to be independent, down to very tiny things all over the more European on the western side of the Ural Mountains areas known as oblasts. You might have heard that word a lot recently due to the Ukraine war, thinking about places such as the Donbass and other individual places like that. Luhansk comes to mind. These oblasts are smaller regions that are more directly tied to Mr. Putin. So you have some aspects of the government and the elected officials that are basically United Russia cronies for Putin, installed there by him and then voted on by the people. And other places in which they will send their own representatives to go to the State Duma and the upper house, known as the Federation Council, who are not appointed or elected by the Putin apparatus, but still kind of subservient to it, right? Again, Russians vote by the millions. It's just that they don't have very many options. Their options are curated for them, and they're highly encouraged to choose some folks over others. And so you start to ask yourself, if the options aren't really viable, right? Is that really that democratic in a Western sense? No. But again, democracy means different things to different people. And to some nation states, just having the vote, the franchise being given, and suffrage rights being given to people is enough to call yourself democratic. The outcome of what that vote actually creates in terms of policy momentum is something different. This is a relatively new nation born from the downfall and the complete dismantling of the USSR, right? And when we're talking about it, you basically have a situation where, as of the mid 90s, it becomes the foremost state in a group called the Commonwealth of Independent States, right? Which is sort of looser affiliation of the former Soviet, sort of satellite nations, and Russia being the foremost. Um, it had the most prestige of them. The president of the federation at that time was Boris Yeltsin, and I have to say, from a historical perspective, mistakes were made very quickly, almost too quickly, I'd argue. He moves from a very planned command economy to an almost complete laissez-faire market economy, and what he was talking about as shock therapy for the Russian economy. Um, some groundwork should have been laid to start to get Russian citizens used to the norms of how a market economy would function. Some sort of socialist bridge where some things stayed maybe state operated and state organized, whereas others maybe not. But it didn't happen like that overnight. Basically, you move right into a market economy. This created large amounts of upheaval, and it let some people who did have the education and who did have the cash and the capital at hand to seize the initiative and opportunity given at this time to implant themselves as a new oligarchical class. And it led them to begin this mad scramble for incredible wealth. And even to this day, many outsiders looking at the Russian Federation's economic and political structure refer to it as a kleptocracy, in which the people who steal the best are the people who govern the nation. As a result, too, you saw steady climbs in what used to be a very, very slight, very tight genie in the Soviet Union has started to get wider and wider and grow over time as these oligarchs and their economic sort of growth begin to outpace the development of the Russian middle class. Once we get to Putin's era, he sort of represented, or at least he put himself forward as a rebranding of the Russian Federation under some of the more popular feels of the Soviet Union. We're going to be stronger in our military again. We're going to be more united, hence the name of the actual party, United Russia. And we're going to stop having all of these oligarchs run willy-nilly. I'm going to get them under control and put them under, the auspices of the government. in order to do what's best for the people. And all these individuals trying to push Western ideas are really just trying to weaken us. And that's sort of been a bit of the Russian sort of fear geographically ever since the inception of the Soviet Union, right? That you're going to have all these other nations from the West conspiring against you. And it kind of goes back to its geography, being that there is no real way to defend from just looking at Russian territory, an attack from the European side being as a massive, just flat plain right there. They can just roll in through Poland and through places like Belarus, through Ukraine, right? As we come back to that issue. Um, so these ideas, the pernicious ideas and the armies of the West can roll through. So we must remain vigilant as Russians and be very careful to maintain our strength at all costs. And if I can offer you strength, but at the same time, maybe take away some of your democratic rights, that's a good trade because strength matters more than anything else. That's kind of like Putin's main line there. And that's been a kind of a thing that makes you want to say he's not really more of someone pushing the ideas of another Soviet like general secretary, a la Gorbachev or a Khrushchev or a Stalin or a Lenin. He sounds in his rhetoric to me a lot more like going back before the Soviet Union to more like a czar type figure. So who really runs stuff in the Russian Federation? It's Putin. It's the president. And in fact, the president has become so powerful that he's begun to make alterations to the Constitution. And we'll see another individual in Mr. Xi in the PRC that has also altered the Constitution for his benefit, right? And once the president can do that, once the president can either alter a constitution or convince the judiciary branch, who should be maintaining a coherent interpretation of a constitution as a safeguard of rule of law in at least a Western point of view, right? What happens then is that the Constitution can kind of be weaponized against the people. Now, one thing too that authoritarian rulers have to do to maintain a legitimate sort of depression of civil rights in order to retain more authority is to basically guarantee economic growth, right? And this is why individuals in the Russian oil industry, steel industry, precious metals, and other minerals, as found all throughout the Far East, these individuals have to be in cahoots with Putin. They roll together because if there were any major reforms, if United Russia were to lose to the Liberal Democratic Party or something like that, or the Communist Party, what would happen is, on the one hand, if Lib Dems won, there'd be all sorts of changes involving taxation that might basically rob the oligarchs of a lot of their wealth. On the other hand, if the Communist Party were to win, we're talking about a situation where a lot of those privately owned corporations might end up becoming state-owned enterprises, SOEs again, and their profits be funneled right into the government budget and not into all their beautiful mega yachts and their supercars and everything else that they have. Their beautiful dashas along the Black Sea, so on and so forth, right? So Putin and the oligarchs are kind of the top kleptocrats at the very top of the sphere. And there's other security operatives that they kick down money to maintain their relative security. And it's interesting to think the fact that some of the skills that Putin might have gotten in terms of being able to compromise people and blackmail them, which was known as compromat, right? Illicit materials that can ruin people's careers. So therefore he can squeeze them and extort them to stay in line with his policies, as well as his ability to go ahead and find unique routes for certain economic goods to move them across markets and such. Make him, interestingly enough, very well suited and for this role of trying to build the Russian Federation as sort of an iconoclast against the grain, sort of new rising power against the West. But make no mistake, the power networks he's building with these oligarchs, he's definitely on top of them. And so the military and the oligarchs occupy this iron triangle space with him. It's Putin as one vertex, the security services, and the oligarchs. And that right there, and I guess you can make some room for the mass media too, as long as they play ball. They're kind of under the thumb of the security services. So that makes sense as the iron triangle for the Russian Federation. Like, how did this happen? How did such a strong global player like the USSR? Well, I mean, say what you want about planned economies and their efficiency and whatnot, but it became very clear as you got to the 80s that the Soviet Union was in dire straits. Um, Money supply was short. People were having a hard time getting paid in rubles. Um, Individuals were reeling from seeing the USSR exposed in a proxy war in Afghanistan, in which they were losing badly because of the U.S. intervention of the CIA with the group known as the Mujahideen. Maybe you heard of one prominent Mujahideen leader by the name of Osama bin Laden. Maybe that rings a bell. Um, we also see a situation where the vaunted STEM and technological superiority of the Soviet Union was put into question after the Chernobyl disaster leaked all sorts of radioactive materials into Eastern Europe, all the way up into Scandinavia, down into the Balkans. Um, they also tried to keep pace with a massive American spending on military regime done by Ronald Reagan. And all of these different pressures led to the general secretary at the time, Mikhail Gorbachev, to push for some openness and some restructuring in the form of glasnost and perestroika, right? And we're going to come back to reform and opening up. And you're trying to start to wonder who did this first? Was it him or was it our friend, the paramount leader of China during the late 70s, early 80s, Deng Xiaoping, that did it first? So, you'll be able to be like, is it an idea that both nations had at the same time, or was really Gorbachev trying to copy from Deng? But either way, what happened was people thought, oh, restructuring, openness, so political openness, right? And political restructuring. Maybe it's not quite what Gorbachev had in mind, but that's what they start pushing anyway. And that sort of seeming democratization led to too much protest too quickly. It starts at the Soviet satellites in Eastern Europe, looking at things like Solidarity in Poland, looking at like the Velvet Revolution going on in other parts of Eastern Europe. And all of a sudden, next thing I know, I woke up in the morning and my mom's telling me to come look at some dudes hitting the Berlin Wall with sledgehammers, which was wild to me. But it was a story of, again, change needed to happen earlier, but because of repression and because of a lack of initiative by leadership, when it did happen, it was open like floodgates, like Pandora's box, and all of these outcomes happened, and Gorbachev couldn't control it. Keep that in mind, because I'd argue the same thing happened economically with Boris Yeltsin. Again, reforms, gradual reforms rather, towards the market revolution that was taking place after the fall of the Soviet Union should have been initiated by Yeltsin, but instead of doing it gradually, he just flung the doors open and said, whatever, let's open the things right up. Why would you do that? Having seen how badly glasnost and perestroika worked, I think some could argue maybe he did it for his own personal gain. There are serious allegations of major corruption, major skimming off the top of some of these formerly state-owned enterprises going right into Yeltsin's pockets. You might say that he's kind of maybe the OG kleptocrat of Russian presidents before Putin. Maybe someone kind of taught him the game of how to do it, right? And in fact, you're looking at the exit strategy for Yeltsin to leave the Russian Federation presidency and not face massive corruption charges. It might have been the exchange made to have Putin replace him as his tapped, sort of successor because Putin had the security apparatus connections to make sure that didn't happen, to erase evidence, do whatever he needed to do in order to keep Yeltsin safe, right? So as Putin serves as fixer for Yeltsin, you might be able to say then that maybe that then cemented Putin's approach. It's like, all right, I'm going to go ahead and allow for markets to get privatized. I'm going to get in tight with the oligarchs, just like Yeltsin was. And as a result, what I'm going to do is, yeah, I'm basically going to have some economic upheaval. But so long as the main industries of the oligarchs are still, selling, and of course, we're talking about things that have much, much demand throughout the globe, which Russia has a lot of, right? Here's looking at you, oil and metals and minerals, right? That's going to be enough to go ahead and guarantee some economic solvency for the country while I continue to do what he taught me to do, which is just make money. And there's some people who suggest that maybe, maybe Mr. Putin is one of the real richest people in the world. I'm sure he does not want that broadcast, but it could be true. What we see in general here is that these weaker political and economic institutions enabled individuals with the know-how, with the skill sets, whether they are intelligence skill sets, whether they are economic knowledge above and beyond the average Russian, to understand like, you don't want these shares in these companies called Gazprom and Yukos Oil. Oh, well, I'll take those shares off your hands, and here's some rubles, right? And then with people not knowing how much those shares were going to be worth in the future, basically just settling for quick cash when they were going to have a fortune if they just stayed and they held on to those shares, right? And then, of course, there's Putin, an individual who, now again, it's more about him than it is about his party or the institutions. It looked like for a while there he had a partner in Dmitry Medvedev, who was an individual who became president and allowed Putin to become prime minister of the Duma for a hot minute. So that way he could go ahead and alter the actual constitution to make it so he can get reelected. And they switched back. Many people who are chess fans call that the castling maneuver between those two. And Medvedev is still an important person in terms of the higher levels of the government of the Russian Federation, with no real successor in light. You know, it just seems like it's more and more about Putin himself and glorifying him and doing his bidding. It's not really about anything involving the future of anybody who takes on that role. He is the future, he is the present, and he was the recent past, which is why you can start to think of him trying to generate what's called a cult of personality, which is going to be also another thing that weakens institutions as a result. Um, Here are some key themes for you. The Russian Federation is a rentier state. They get a large amount of their tax earnings, not from a diverse tax base of workers, but primarily through selling energy, metals, and minerals to their partners throughout the world. People vote there, but not in the Western sense. Their ballots they cast don't really have much of a real outcome on policy. It's Putin's policy. The whatever he feels is best is what happens there. As a result, I imagine if anyone does manage to go ahead and supplant him, which could happen, this disaster in Ukraine could eventually become toxic the same way that the misguided Afghanistan adventure uh, partially did in the Soviet Union. They don't call Afghanistan the graveyard of empires for no reason, right? This could be that sort of thing, that sort of Vietnam War to the US. That's the kind of thing this could be for Putin, which ultimately ruins him politically. Um, but even then, protest against the war is largely muted because of his dominance over security forces and a very weak and limited civil society. People do not protest much or often due to fear of what happens to them when they are caught. Here are some different ways they might ask you about things about Russia. Again, we mentioned this in the UK video, comparing how a parliamentary nation such as the UK, how their executive power works versus how it works in Russia, explaining how that vertical power led for the authoritarian capture of the Russian government, as well as looking at the economic and political implications of some of these reforms, such as shock therapy, and how that has led it to become a rentier state, relying almost for about one quarter to one third of its government budget coming from sales of oil, steel, and other precious minerals slash metals. Remember this: the Russian Federation is an authoritarian system where power is centralized in the presidency, supported by elite networks and controlled political competition. When we talk next time, friends, and we get into Mexico, we'll see this same pattern of elite networks again, but there'll be a bit more competition, still controlled ish, but not nearly as such. So stay tuned for that one. Hope this was useful for you. Let's go out there and get full command of this CompGov material and crush that test. Take care, everybody. Bye bye.